welcome to the Skiffy and Fanny Show.
You are number 6. I am not a number, I am a free person. Ha 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 ha!
I'm Shaun.
I'm Paul.
And tonight we are joined by SF writer Bethany Jacobs for our final interview of the year. Welcome, Bethany.
Hi guys, happy to be here.
So Bethany Jacobs earned a PhD in American Literature from the University of Oregon. Oh, we're going to have a conversation later, by the way, because I didn't realize that was true. And after a 10-year career teaching writing and science fiction, she left academia to go work in education tech. Her 2023 debut novel, These Burning Stars, first in the Kingdom trilogy, became a 2024 Philip K. Dick Award winner and a Dragon BSFS and Locust Award finalist, not with a T. Although there might be a Locust Award out there, and you can win that one too. She was also finalist for the World Science Fiction Association's Astounding Award, and the second novel, On Vicious Worlds, came out last year. Daniel reviewed that, by the way, on the blog and interviewed Bethany on the blog as well. And Paul reviewed it for Nerds of the Feather. But Paul and I are here today because we're going to get to talk to Bethany on the podcast about this series and the final novel, This Brutal Moon, newly published by Orbit Books.
But before we get into our discussion, listeners, a reminder to our listeners to please share your questions and comments with us. You can do this at skiffyandfantasy.com/listener suggestions or hit us up at social media. If you aren't already, you can join us on Twitch for Shaun's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central to be a part of our interactive live streaming show format. Finally, be sure to review and spread the word about our ridiculous show. Help support us through our Patreon and be part of our Torture Cinema polls and put us through all sorts of torture on what we want to watch. You can also join live watches and other special Patreon-only events on our Discord.
That's true. All right, so
only
first,
at least $1 a month.
Yes, $1 of money that you don't need for anything important.
Important.
The rule. Food and medication come first. And housing. And, anyway.
Yeah.
So, Bethany, let's start with a big question, which is, I think, a hard one, which is, can you tell us about the Kingdom trilogy, and then I suppose This Brutal Moon, kind of how it's positioned in that trilogy?
Yeah, so the Kingdom trilogy, which begins with These Burning Stars. So These Burning Stars is a novel about a thief and hacker who uncovers a secret about a powerful family. And the representatives of that family are sent to basically track her down and stop her from selling that secret. Those representatives are at the same time being hunted by a figure from their past. And so the book is essentially a cat and mouse and cat story of competing loyalties, subterfuge, and systemic violence by the ruling power of the kingdom, which is what the trilogy is named for. And like many great space operas, it's set in a different universe from ours, which is one of the great pleasures of space operas, that you're not bound by the real world. You can just make up whatever you want it to be. And This Brutal Moon, which is the completion of the trilogy, sees the characters engaged in a basically universe-wide rebellion against the corrupt powers to liberate oppressed people and get revenge on those who have basically spent centuries trying to kill them.
Ooh, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Pretty intense and a pretty good elevator pitch.
Definitely.
Why, thank you.
So
right
I
off the top of my head.
So I want to start with more of a writing question, because you are one of a handful this year who, I think one of two maybe, where we've actually interviewed someone further into a series, in this case at the end of it. And I want to ask about that kind of process of, did you kind of see this the whole time, or did this kind of develop sort of naturally? And were you surprised by any part of the sort of writing of This Brutal Moon in particular?
Yeah, so when I wrote the first novel, I had a sense of how the story might continue, but I purposefully wrote it as a standalone novel because I wanted to be able to market it to publishers. So I wrote it as a standalone novel, knowing that it could go further, but that it would be fine on its own. And when my publisher bought it, they basically said, "Could you expand this? Do you have any other ideas?" And I was like, "Yeah, I can make this a trilogy." And so there were enough seeds within the first book for me to build out and understand what the larger story would be. Um, so I had like a rough sense of what was going to happen and where the characters were going to end up. But both in the sequel and in this Brutal Moon, things they everything just goes off the rails when I write. I'm a big planner, I'm a big plotter of my work, but I do that very much with the understanding that my plot will end up being very different from what I imagined initially. And so there are whole POVs in book 3 that like I had no conception of in book 1. Like I did not know this important character was going to even exist in book 3. So that I think is a big part of the pleasure for me is that I can't just like map everything out and then write it like I'm ticking off a list. Like the story moves and grows and I have like revelations about it as I'm writing that change the direction it goes in. And so that definitely is what happened with this Brutal Moon, even though I went into writing it with this like understanding of what it was about and where it was going to go.
This Brutal Moon has jumping around in timelines, which I didn't which like the first two books, but I didn't expect in the third book because I expected it to be more linear. Did you have that in mind when you started writing this third book, and how much of this third book was in your mind when you were writing the previous two novels?
Yeah, so in both the first and second book, we have this time hopping thing um, as a way to sort of provide context and drama. And so in the third book, I knew that I wanted to do that again, but originally the past tense POV, the character whose past we were going to see, was actually going to be Chono. Um, and I realized that as much fun as that would be, um, that there was a different story that I needed to tell to make the book come together. And it's not a spoiler to say that the character of Dre Brit, who is a leader of the Javeni at the time of the Javeni genocide, I just realized that like that was that in order to bring the story of the Javeni full circle from the genocide to their battle in the present time, I really needed to tell that story from the perspective of someone who was there. And
Okay.
so that was not the original plan, but it quickly became apparent to me that like that was the way it had to go.
Hmm. Okay, I have one more craft question, and then I think we'll start getting into some specifics in this book. This is space opera. It's epic in scope. Um, you'd mentioned, I think, much earlier here that a lot of this is a sort of invented world, invented universe. You can kind of set it in a distant place, and you can add and develop all of these things. And so there's a sort of two part. One would be like, what is it about that space opera subgenre that sort of appeals to you? And then how would you kind of describe your world building approach to developing a sort of space opera universe?
Yeah, so while I have always been a huge fan of space opera, this was actually the first space opera I ever wrote. And what draws me to space opera is my genre interests and influences are quite fluid. And one of the things I like about space opera is the influence of high fantasy on space opera. And a lot of like people who've read the trilogy will definitely see the high fantasy elements of it.
Hmm.
Um, and so what attracts me to space opera is the epic scope, the kind of science fantasy, high fantasy elements that play into it, but also space opera has a very human
very character and social issues driven history. You know, classic texts like Dune and Star Wars and what have you. They're existing on this epic scale with this huge world building and these different aliens and you know all of this fun you know Disneyland stuff. But they're also always trying to tell an incredibly human story of survival and resilience and community. And that's just kind of my vibe as a writer. So it felt very natural to write a book like that. In terms of how I went about creating, you know, these brand new worlds, when I approach world building and when I approach creating a civilization or a planet or what have you, I try to really think about the way that people actually live and what aspects of society impact their daily life. So things like meteorology, geology, economy, what's the currency they're using, what's the language that they're speaking, what are the religious rites that they use in their day-to-day life. Like these are all things, you know, what's the terrain where they live? Do they live in a city on the coast? Do they live on a space station? You know, how one of the things when I was writing the perspective of the Givenni, for example, when they're living on the moon, and I don't know if I did this entirely successfully, but what I really tried to think about were like, what are the metaphors and idioms that a society that has always lived on a rock would have? Right? They're probably not going to sing songs about like verdant forests and flowing rivers, right? They're going to sing songs about rock and labor and tunnels. Um, and so like that's an example of where when I tried to think about and the Givenni are a very kind of Spartan people and they're a very serious people and there are people who are very highly organized and can get shit done and they're self-sacrificing. Those are the kinds of things that would arise from a community that has to survive on dome cities on an abandoned moon. You know, they're not going to be an opulent people. So I really try to let those kinds of cultural considerations drive the world building when I create a civilization. And so there's so much world building content that's just in my world building documents and like never even comes up in the books. Like you wouldn't know unless you asked me, but like it all had to be there for me to create the world, even if not all of it made it onto the page.
Sure. So okay. So more about world building.
I did this on purpose,
so
Paul. I did that on purpose. I knew I was gonna send you up into a world building tunnel. Go for it.
Yep.
I love world building. So
I'm going for it. So when I read these burning stars, I thought the main characters were Essex Six and Chono. But as the series has gone on, in addition to being this Givenni story, it's really Chono's story more than anything else. So I wanted you to talk about the role and building of religion and religious institutions, faith, and the corruption of that into use of and the objects of power, because Chono's kind of being pushed and prodded into positions they don't really want to. But you use religion in a number of different cultures and a number of different ways throughout these three books. I wanted you to talk about how you develop the religious societies that are essential to the Kingdom trilogy.
yeah. So I will say it's interesting that you say that the trilogy is Chono's story. I also think of it as Chono's story, but there are a lot of readers who see it as Jun's story and see her as the central character. So I find that really interesting because I tend to think of it as being Chono's story too, but at the same time, as I've met lots of readers, it's just interesting how different people bring a different perspective to it. So it's really interesting that you say that. So when it comes to developing the religion, that arose initially from When I talked about having to create a world that reflects how people really lived. So I wanted to create this despotic ruling government, right? And I tried to think what would be the main pillars of such a civilization where, well, there would be a military arm, most definitely. There would be an economic and legal arm, and then there would be a religious arm. That to me were the three central things that I imagined a civilization would have to have. Now, I'm sure we could have conversations about other pillars, but those were the ones I came up with. And so then when I created the religion itself, I did not think it was realistic, for example, for it to be a monotheistic religion. There's too many planets, too many civilizations, too much history. I didn't think that made sense. And also, um, you know, uh, as a millennial who grew up studying Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology and Hinduism and and Celtic mythologies and all of these things. Like I grew up obsessed with pantheons. And so I knew that I wanted to create a pantheon. And I wanted, so there is kind of a central god, which is called the Godfire, but the Godfire is more of like an idea and an entity than an actual god with a personality. I really wanted to think about how the different planets might glom on to a specific god and how that god would come to represent and drive the civilization itself. So, for example, the planet of Taros, it has a lot of its main god is Tarotanteris, who's a god of tricksters and thieves and drinking and gambling. And Taros itself is a little bit of a muddy backwater. It's not the most opulent of the planets, but it's a center of a lot of crime. It's a center of a lot of back alley dealing, and so it would make sense that civilizations from a planet like that would really glamorize a god that Tarotanteris is described as having many arms, and in one arm he's holding a tankard, and in one arm he's playing dice, and in one arm he's got a knife. And so the sort of multiplicity of that sort of backwater society, whereas the planet Makess is a place of great wealth and riches and high society, and its god is a fertility goddess, right? And she's a goddess of beauty, and she's a goddess of life and growth and greenery. And so when thinking about the planets and then thinking about the gods, I really tried to think about what would be the idioms that those civilizations would use based on their gods, and how might the name of the god actually impact language, um, and naming conventions and things like that. So it sort of grew again out of this attempt to think about how does a civilization create a god, and how does a god create a civilization, and the cyclicality of that.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I don't know that I have a follow up to religion, but I was curious about the technological developments too, which do somewhat feed into the religious elements. Um, I was really struck particularly by this sort of gate technology. Then there's this sequence in here where they're basically buying the cores, and they're I won't tell
Mhm.
you about what happens, but like there's a whole thing about how these are incredibly dangerous and valuable things, but they have, if you've got very long-term vision, could be very useful.
Mhm.
And technology obviously plays a big part of the plot line in this, not just because of these big forms of technology, but also there are a lot of ways in which technology is used for subterfuge and manipulation. It is used for terror and destruction. It seemed very clear that throughout this book you were looking at technology not just as a tool for us to use in our sort of daily lives, but all the ways that it can be used to sort of control and manipulate and be part of political games, even religious faith, etc. And I wanted you to
Mhm.
hopefully could talk a little bit about sort of your approach to technology in this book.
Yeah, well, I think my first disclaimer is that this book is not hard sci-fi,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It is not at all interested in giving detailed explanations of how the technology works. It is much more interested in the ways that technology impacts society, and the way that society uses technology, which is exactly what you're talking about right there. Um, so something that I prefer in my sci-fi and space opera is when it acknowledges the fact that the means of space travel, the means of ship flight and trade between different planets would be incredibly expensive and resource dependent, right? If we think about the way that oil works in our own world, it's one of the most corrupt and deadly and horrific industries, perhaps the most horrific industry on our planet, right? And we need it to power our technology. Um, and so the need for it and the money in it is what drives that corruption. And so at the center of the Kingdom trilogy is basically this battle over resources, which the Javeni people are at the center of. And so I wanted to, so, even though I'm not going into deep technical explanation of how the gates work, it it did seem to me that there would be some kind of technological core to a gate, right? It's not a wormhole. It's a man-built thing. Um, and so I tried to think about, like, would that technology be rare? Where would you get it? Would it be legal to have it? Um, and yeah, the actual act of getting a hold of one of these gate cores, as it were, it's not as simple as just buying it on an open market. And so, and also, just thinking about the ways that technology and energy are very powerful and thus very dangerous, right? They're always incredibly dangerous. They're literally weapons. Um, both on a an act like a literal level and on a sociological and metaphorical level, like energy is a weapon. And so everything about my approach to technology in the books is thinking about it as a locus of power. So, for example, the technology by which people like the best way to compare it to the real world is like the computer programming hacking version of technology in my world is called casting, right? And I intentionally did not explain the technology or the science behind casting, and in many ways wrote it to resemble magic work, like wizardry, because I wanted to imbue it with this sense of that kind of high fantasy miraculousness. Um, the idea that casting tech would be like casting spells, and that a truly talented caster like Jin Ironway would essentially be a wizard. Because and part of that is because for so many of us, we don't have the least understanding of how technology actually works, right? We can't explain why my phone is projecting my picture across, you know, thousands and thousands of miles. Like some people can, but the average person can't. And so it's a kind of wizardry. Um, and so I wanted to explore Jun's casting ability as a locus of power, and I wanted to explore the energy trade as the sort of the the generative evil of this civilization in how it impacts everybody.
Yeah, this was one of the things I thought you're leading me down the path to the stuff that I found very interesting from a sort of political level, which is like the control of technology, the control of people, the control of labor as well. There's sequences in this book where you have characters literally pointing out like people have been disappeared into camps. And you're now talking about, like, in these very clever treatments of language, about bringing people back to be voluntary laborers, ? And a big part of that is like woven into not only the way in which a society that has profit motives and scarcity as centrist to it means that the control of technology and resources, etc., is naturally, as you pointed out, going to lead to some degree or maybe lots of degrees of corruption as people try to control those things. But then human labor becomes a part of that equation as well. And it becomes also a political pawn, I suppose, is they don't have chess there, but if they did in this universe, right? And it seemed to me that you were making very deliberate, obviously space opera scale sort of commentary on this very serious issue of how we treat humans within these kinds of systems, the kinds of questions about agency and civil rights and ownership of your own labor and the value of the human self as a part of that. That seemed to be what you were going for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that one of the things that for me is very true to life about the books is that, and again, spoiler alert, as soon as the GoodpodsHQ liberate themselves from the kingdom immediately starts trying to trick them into becoming slaves again. And in how many ways does our own society and the powers that be in our society try to trick us into enslaving ourselves and tell us it's what's best for us and tell us that it's what we need? How do systems, if we think about the prison industrial complex in the US, for example, arises specifically out of the context of the emancipation of slaves. Oh, well, slavery is illegal now, so we need to find a way to make slavery legal. Oh, prisons. We just call you a criminal, and then we can put you in our prisons, and you can have the same level of rights as if you were a slave. And that has persisted in our society and continued to decimate Black communities and Latino communities because when power and evil loses its hold, it tries to find a back door. And so that is a big thing that's at play in these books, is that as soon as the GoodpodsHQ are out of the kingdom's clutches, they take with them a huge amount of institutional knowledge and expertise that the kingdom needs in order to keep the energy trade moving. And so the kingdom's main priority is to re-enslave them again, and it will do whatever it has to do to accomplish that. And so, and I think we're seeing this as well in the current immigration crisis. We're rounding up huge swaths of farm workers, right, and putting them in camps and then putting them to work as prisoners in ICE camps. And so, this is, and the goal there is just more power and more money and more control and there are so many other contemporary and historical examples of this same dynamic.
It seems like a element of that's at the core is this, I'll call it the profit motive, the need to constantly be able to extract, quote, wealth, whatever we'll describe wealth as, from something. Because if we have like your Star Trek universe, more or less, right, the sort of utopian idea where mostly people have everything they need, right? And so now what do you do with yourselves? Well, I don't have to make money, right? I don't have to do all of this stuff. I can just go like be a scientist or like be a farmer for fun, or like own my own winery if I just want to for funsies. But in a universe like this, or like the one we're living in literally right now, or your own novels, right, that desire to control and take, right? Eventually you can only take so much, for you must take from people even more, right? Take their freedoms, trick them, manipulate in order to continue to extract. And that kind of transactional view of the world just leads to basically ceasing to view people as inherently valuable as just living beings.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the thing about Star Trek, which by the way I love and think was such a socially progressive show, but the whole thing about Star Trek is it's a colonialist enterprise, right? Yeah, they have everything they need and nobody has to work anymore. So what do? They go out and explore other civilizations. And although there's no violent colonialism happening in Star Trek, or at least the original Star Treks, the implication of that is a romanticizing of European expansion and colonialism, right? And we see the same thing, for example, in Ian Banks's Culture series, right? Everybody is happy and has everything they need, but what do with that? Well, they go out and think about whether or not they should assimilate other civilizations into their utopic world, even though they know that it would lead to billions of people dying because, it would be better in the long run. And so I don't really know where I was going with that, honestly, but I think that these things are kind of like in the same thread of what we're talking about here is, you know, even if we are wealthy and powerful and have everything that we need, are we content to just be that? Or do we then go out and search for more and more? I mean, I think we see in the sort of obsession with billionaires that like nothing is enough, right? We even when money ceases to have meaning, we want more of it to the impact to the effect that this small amount of people is responsible for the deaths of millions.
It is an addiction. So, side note. So, last week I went to the James J. Hill house. James J. Hill was a railroad baron, magnate, robber baron from the late 19th century. He has a giant mansion in St. Paul, and the docent was talking about when he would start building up his fortune. Hill said, "Oh yes, when I get to $100,000, I will stop and just live on that." When he died, and he was worth in like 1916 $56 million. He didn't stop. He just kept going and going and going. It's like an endless feeding of that greed. I don't know if greed's the right word. That drive within him just kept him accumulating things until basically his death. It's like, so there's something inside people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that having makes us terrified of having less. Like as soon as we have something, all we want is to have more because the prospect of having less is terrifying once you've had something. Um, I had this experience recently where I took a new job that actually pays less than my previous job. And there was a terror in that, right? Because it's like, well, no, you can't go back. You can't go back. You can only go forward. Your salary must go up and up and up. And I just don't. I think that that's not true. And I mean, to take it back to the book, there are a lot of characters in this series where their fatal flaw is the wanting of more, the desire to grow and have and have and have, until they basically eat themselves with their own greed, um, and sometimes that's literally like, you know, the desire to build a energy empire. And sometimes that's just the desire to see one's revenge plot to its conclusion. So one of the things about the book is that the character of Six, again, spoilers, their entire life is dedicated to revenge. But when they've had their revenge, is that enough? No, they have to find another mission. And ultimately the desperation for an outward mission and an outward revenge takes them away from themselves, and they have to learn to actually look inward in order to survive. And I think that so many of us so many of the people who are obsessed with power and money, they don't look inward. They don't, you know, assess themselves or study themselves or really try to grow or think about their impact on the world. They are miserly and entirely materialistic, and you can see that rot, certainly in the U.S., but in lots of places.
And certainly in this book, I like you use the word, this sort of rot, because it sort of manifests in this book in a lot of very different ways. It's not just through the sort of stuff we're talking about now, right? The pursuit of power and wealth and revenge and these things and what they do to us and our inability to sort of pause and maybe look inward and ask whether or not these are the things we want our lives defined by. But there's also this element throughout your book here where you're very much dealing with what happens when civilizations or groups of people are harmed by other groups of people, and how quickly that makes everybody suspicious of each other. We always assume every motive is a bad motive, even when it's not necessarily the case, because that sort of, I'll call it trauma for the lack of a better word. I'm not sure what else you would call it, but that trauma that's there, manifesting across civilizations and across communities makes any actual more positive work much more difficult to manifest because you effectively lose the ability to trust other people. And in some cases for good reason, because in this book, many people are in fact trying to manipulate and take things from you. And in that kind of world, like it's all, there's like a biblical phrase about like, spiting yourself for your own eye or whatever that line is.
Yeah.
Right?
Fighting something, your nose to your face, something like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it seemed like that was something you were also really interested in exploring, is really what I'm getting at. So I hope you could talk about that compounding of suffering, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Paul was saying earlier about like this largely being Chono's story is like the big tragedy and conflict for Chono is that she doesn't want power. She doesn't want to be the thing that drives revolution, and she doesn't want to be a part of a rebellion. She really just wants, but at the same time, she wants absolution for the crimes that she's been complicit in. And they say this all the time, that in order to be a good leader, you need to not actually want to be a leader, but like that's not realistic in the real world. In the real world, people who seek leadership are a specific kind of people, and often a sociopathic kind of person, even when they do good. And the only saving grace for Chono ultimately is her understanding of how she is culpable for some of the evils in the world. That's what keeps her grounded. That's what keeps her from repeating the evils, is because she has entirely looked inward and confronted her culpability and chosen instead to be swallowed by some kind of useless guilt complex. She has realized that it is her moral obligation to try to mitigate the effects of the evil that she's been complicit in. And I think that only someone who comes at the world with that depth of humility and that recognition that they are not a good person, that being a good person can't be like this. I think that so many people, we hear so many people talk about like, well, I'm a good person. It's like, well, what the fuck do you mean you're a good person? Like, what are you actually doing in the world that makes you a good person? Chono's not sitting around saying, I'm a good person. Chono's saying, I will completely sublimate my needs for my community. That might not be entirely healthy, but I think it's the only reason why she is less likely to be a corrupt leader than these other people who have modeled leadership for her.
Or the people that are trying to push her into various positions of power and leadership, whether she'll like it or not. I mean, she has to come to terms with these in the end. It's a long, slow process in this third book. And she's very reluctant, but it's a matter of contrition and absolution and trying to to try to atone for what she's been complicit in through these 3 novels in her entire life, as being part of this infrastructure of colonial dominance and power, especially over the Giovanni.
Yeah, and the thing about Chono is her entire arc is a movement from passive to active. In book 1, she's an incredibly passive character. Everything is happening around her and happening to her, and she has spent her life being a tool without any power herself. And as her narrative moves forward and she chooses to acknowledge her complicity and say, passivity is not an excuse, she has all of these external forces that are trying to use her and make her a tool. And her arc is about her trying to find the balance between participating in these revolutionary actions without letting anybody just use her for their own political purposes. And so a lot of characters, they're not ready for how badass Chono actually is.
When Chono was
They
moved to
think,
act, yes.
yeah, they think that she's a good person, she's a humble person, blah, blah. She'll be easy to deal with. We'll just use her as a cog in our machine. And Chono is not a soft character. Chono is not an innocent or passive, or she's ultimately an incredibly violent character who's capable of committing great acts of violence.
Yeah, you got a couple of interesting flashbacks there where we show, Chono is not to be messed with when pushed.
Yeah, she can do serious damage, and it's not. I try not to romanticize that element of her, right? I try not to make it like, look how fucking badass Chono actually is. It's like, no, this is actually tragic for Chono. She doesn't want to do this. She doesn't want to be involved in this. Chono wants to go live on a farm in the highlands and and never be bothered again. But she recognizes that if she doesn't use her name, other people will use her name. And the only way for her to prevent others from using her to commit evil is to be entirely active in what her own name means.
Intense. Paul, I'm giving you're getting the last one because I asked like 5 in a row. So sorry, I don't want to be selfish.
That's fine, Shaun. This is a weird out of left field question based on my tagline. Are you in fact a fan of The Prisoner, Dr. Jacobs?
Of The Prisoner? What's The Prisoner?
I guess the answer to that is no. Because
I don't know what The Prisoner is. If you tell me, I might realize I do know what it is.
It's a 1967 one-season spy show about a spy who resigns and is banished to a place for other spies. But everybody has a number. The character's name is number 6.
Oh.
And so when I'm reading these Burning Stars, and you have a number 6 and you have a character they're trying to impersonate, I kept thinking in terms of a prisoner metaphor, because there's an episode where there's a real twisty. This is going to be more of a question, like a comment than a question, where the village tries to get someone to impersonate number 6 to think they're impersonating somebody else. It's very twisted round and round.
Yeah.
And the Essex 6 relationship, especially the first book, I was thinking, is this the schizoid man? Because you have number 6 and another 6, and is this really the Prisoner episode, the schizoid man twisted around?
That is so interesting. Now I'm going to have to look up that show. I mean, I would say that
episode is on YouTube. Yes.
Yeah, I would say that 6's name was probably subliminally suggested to me by the Borg in Star Trek.
Okay.
The idea, I didn't intentionally do that, but it was after I had done it that I had the thought of like, that's really interesting, because in the Borg, who are named after numbers, it's a symbol of their dehumanization. Right. And so 6 takes their kin school name as a kind of rebellion against the way that name signals their own dehumanization. And I think the idea of the number as a dehumanizing way, I mean, we saw that in the Holocaust. We see that in prisons, numbers as a way to dehumanize people. But I have not heard of The Prisoner. I'm gonna check it out now. That sounds really cool.
I just want one more comment then a question. I want to read this from your author's note because I found this moving. The Kingdom trilogy is fundamentally about genocide, both its survivors and those who don't survive, and its perpetrators and those who are complicit in its perpetuation. It's a dark thing to know you are complicit. I think that's why a lot of people relate to Chono's struggle to accept guilt and seek justice, which is a battle that never ends. And you point out the first book came out just before the most recent and horrific genocide, and I want to know if that happening in real time influenced the writing of the second two books.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. One of the things I say was that book one came out right after October 7th.
Yeah.
And I had already written most of the second book at the time. But these books were hugely impacted by histories of genocide of all kinds. But certainly the last book, especially, and when writing the perspective of the ģimeņi who experience a genocide, I was definitely thinking about current events. And there was a story that I read of a woman in Palestine talking about her children being reduced to ash. That a version of that actually exists in the novel. I sort of wrote that into the novel because it impacted me so deeply. And so, when writing it, I was also thinking a lot about Sudan, and I was thinking a lot about the Uyghurs, and I was thinking about people groups that are particularly targeted, but then also about economic impacts. I think a lot about the Congo and the impact of the cobalt mining, that continues decades and decades and decades of colonialist oppression for the people of the Congo. So yeah, I would say that the past couple of years, as discourses of genocide have really blown up in the public sphere, those were discourses that I and many more of us have been talking about forever. And they definitely influence everything that I'm writing, and they influence my new book, and it's all always there with me.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this into a fictional story where people can actually engage with it and actually think inside about their complicity in such things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Well, you mentioned that there's a new book, which kind of means I don't really want to move to the closeout questions because we're talking about something so serious and it feels weird. But I don't.
It's going to be a gear shift, but let's gear shift, Shaun.
But you mentioned there's another book that you're working, and so this is the question, which is what are you working on next? Are you allowed to tell us any?
Yeah, it's funny. I am working on a new book, and it has not been announced yet, so there's probably not a lot that I can say about it. What I will say is that the sort of comp titles, which is a big thing that we use in publishing, is it is influenced by Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness.
Ooh.
Okay.
So, and also by Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation series.
Ooh.
So imagine a kind of fucked up space opera version of that, and that's what I'm working on right now.
Okay, I'm curious. I'm very curious.
Yeah. Can't really say any more about it than that, though.
That's okay. That's okay. You've given me enough in my imagination to think about.
Yes.
And then if folks want to find you and your work, where might they go?
Yeah, so follow me on Instagram. That's my number one social right now. I'm at Dr. Bethany Jacobs. And then I'm also on Blue Sky. You can find me there again at Bethany Jacobs. My website is bethany.jacobs.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter. I'm very accessible on social media, so feel absolutely free to say hi. And you know, if you follow my newsletter, you keep up with my website, or particularly if you keep up with Instagram, you'll see the podcasts I'm on and articles that are published and things like that. So that's the best way to stay in touch.
Perfect. Well, Bethany, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you, guys. This was such a good conversation. It's always so. It's always such a pleasure to have powerful conversations about what's going on in the world and what we're working on. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So for folks at home, if my voice survives this, because it's going, I can hear it leaving me now. If you like, let us know what you thought. Maybe you've read this book or you have other questions. skiffingfanny@gmail.com is one way you can do that. Or if you're on the Discord, there is a book discussion channel where you can talk about books, or a show discussion channel where you can talk about episodes. The show is on Blue Sky, Threads, Mastodon, YouTube, a whole bunch of other places. skiffingfanty.com/skiffythings is where you find that. And then remember, twitch.tv/alphabetstreams is where the live show takes place every Friday, 7 p.m. Central. So you want to catch us live. And then patreon.com/skiffingfanty. If you have money you don't need but would like to give it to us, please do. And then obviously you can review us, tell your friends about the show. If you can, burn us on a CD and throw it at unsuspecting strangers on the street. Nobody has a CD player in their car anymore, so they'll be very confused. But it'll make me happy.
And we want to thank to all of our Patreon supporters that help make this show happen. Like Andrea the Alluring, Cameron the Chthonic, Carolyn the Benevolent, Carrie the Divine, Chris the Candescent, Dan the Transient, Daniel the Cultured, David the Debonair, JC the Jocular, Jeff the Gracious, Joseph the Jovial, Juan the Junctional, I think Juan's in our chat tonight, KB the Kind, Karen the Kickass, Kat the Kinematic, Matthew the Magnificent,
and Paul the Pious, which is also here today. Phoebe the Eloquent, Robin the Bold, Brian the Resilient, Sarah A. the Sensational, Sarah E. the Sublime, Sarah O. the Rapturous, Scott the Gentleman, Stephen the Strange, Tari the Thorough, Tanya the Triumphant, Trish the Imperturbable, who is also in the audience tonight. Also Stephen's here as well. And Victor the Valiant. Thank you all very much. We appreciate you. If you can help us get the other Sarah last name letters, right? We need an I really badly, and then a U, and sometimes a Y.
That's awesome.
Where can people find you, Shaun?
I'm at ShaunDuke.net. Just put /Duke things, and you'll find all my socials. And then I'm here at the same channel Wednesdays, Sundays, 6 p.m. Central. And Paul?
And you can find me on the internet everywhere, ubiquitously, except in places which are fascist and evil, as Prince Justin with a V. PrincejVSTIN. Just Google that and you'll find all the myriad things I do. Way too many things.
Yeah. All right. As required by the Skiffy and Fanny bylaws that were amended this year, I must make it happy. And so to make it happy, I am going to wish Paul a very exciting time, because you just won a trip to the Prisoner's Special Place, whatever they call it. I've never seen the show, so you just have to accept
the Village.
The Village. You're going to the Village on an all expenses paid trip, and your number will be 42.
Thank you, Shaun. Thank you.
You're welcome. You'll leave at 9 a.m. in the morning.
I see.
All right. And on that note, happy ending and see you.